There are some memories that never fade, no matter how many years pass. Even now, when I think back upon those days, I can still see the familiar rooms of Baker Street, the thin figure of Sherlock Holmes seated by the fire, and the strange chain of events that led us towards the greatest danger we had ever faced. Of all the adventures I shared with Holmes, none left a deeper mark upon my life than the one I am about to recount. It was not merely another investigation. It was the final chapter of a long struggle that had been unfolding in secret beneath the surface of London. At the time, I was living quietly with my wife and devoting most of my attention to my medical practice. Holmes and I still met from time to time, but far less often than in our earlier years. His work had taken him across Europe, and reports occasionally appeared in the newspapers describing his involvement in matters of international importance. Then, on a cold evening in April of 1891, something unexpected happened. Without warning, Sherlock Holmes appeared at my consulting room. The moment I saw him, I sensed that something was wrong. He looked thinner than before. His face seemed pale from exhaustion, and there was a tension in his eyes that I rarely witnessed. Holmes was not a man easily troubled by fear, yet on that evening he carried himself like someone who had been hunted for days. As soon as he entered, he carefully secured the shutters of the room and glanced toward the darkened street outside. Gesture struck me at once. This was not the behavior of a detective pursuing a criminal. It was the behavior of a man being pursued. For a few moments, he stood silently, listening. Only when he seemed satisfied that no one had followed him did he sit down beside the lamp. The light revealed fresh injuries across his hand. His knuckles were bruised and bleeding. Whatever had happened before his arrival had not been a simple disagreement. Something far more serious was unfolding. And as I looked at my old friend that night, I felt a growing certainty that we were standing at the edge of a storm unlike anything we had faced before. I did not yet know the name of the enemy, but very soon I would learn of a man whose influence stretched across London like an invisible web, a man whom Sherlock Holmes regarded as the most dangerous criminal mind in Europe. His name was Professor Moriarty. As I sat opposite Sherlock Holmes that evening, I could not shake the feeling that something extraordinary had happened. For years, I had watched him face murderers, thieves, blackmailers, and spies. Danger was as familiar to him as the streets of London. Yet now there was a strain upon his features that I had never seen before. He seemed alert to every sound. Even inside the safety of my consulting room, his attention drifted again and again toward the shuttered windows. It was as though an unseen enemy lurked somewhere beyond them. The injuries upon his hand only deepened my concern. Holmes dismissed them with little interest, but I knew they were evidence of a recent struggle. Troubled me even more was the unusual request he soon made. He wished to leave my house by climbing over the garden wall rather than using the front door. Such precautions were unlike him. Holmes was a man who often walked directly into danger when duty required it, yet now he behaved as though every street corner concealed a threat. The realization sent a chill through me. For the first time since I had known him, Sherlock Holmes appeared to be the hunted rather than the hunter. As the silence stretched between us, I began to understand that he had not come merely for conversation. He had come because events had reached a critical point. For months, perhaps even years, he had been engaged in a secret battle, hidden from public view. While London slept peacefully, an invisible war had been unfolding in the shadows. And according to Holmes, that war was approaching its final stage. The police did not yet know the full truth. The newspapers suspected nothing. But somewhere in the city, a powerful figure was directing crimes with remarkable skill, remaining untouched while others carried out his plans. Holmes had spent countless hours tracking this hidden force. Every clue, every arrest, every unsolved mystery seemed to point toward the same source. At last, after years of searching, he believed he had discovered the mind behind it all, a criminal unlike any he had encountered before. A man so intelligent and so careful that most people had never even heard his name. As Holmes prepared to explain the truth, I sensed that everything was about to change. For the enemy he was hunting was no ordinary criminal. He was the architect of an empire built upon crime itself. Holmes settled into his chair and rested his long fingers together. The lamp cast deep shadows across his face, making him appear older and more worn than I had ever known him. Yet behind the exhaustion, his eyes still burned with the same sharp intelligence that had solved so many mysteries. What he told me that evening revealed a hidden side of London that few people could even imagine. For many years, Holmes explained, he had noticed a strange pattern in the criminal world. Again and again, crimes appeared unrelated on the surface. A theft in one district, a forgery in another, a disappearance somewhere else, different criminals, different victims, different motives. Yet Holmes sensed something connecting them. It was not evidence that could be presented in court. It was not a clue that could be touched or photographed. It was a feeling born from years of observation. Whenever a major criminal escaped justice, whenever a carefully planned crime seemed impossible to explain, Holmes detected the shadow of the same unseen influence. Someone was guiding events from behind the scenes, someone who never appeared in public records, someone who never left fingerprints behind. The more Holmes investigated, the more convinced he became that London's underworld was not a collection of separate criminals. It was an organization, and at its center sat a single mastermind. For years he followed faint traces, often reaching dead ends. Time after time the trail vanished before he could identify the person responsible, but Holmes refused to abandon the pursuit. Patiently, he gathered fragments of information, a name mentioned here, a suspicious connection there, small details that seemed meaningless to others. Eventually, those fragments formed a picture. The hidden ruler of this criminal empire was a man called Professor James Moriarty. To the public, Moriarty appeared respectable. He had once been a brilliant mathematician whose work was admired across Europe. His reputation suggested intelligence, education, and achievement. Yet, according to Holmes, that respectable appearance concealed something far darker. Behind the mask of scholarship stood the most dangerous criminal mind in Europe. A man who rarely committed crimes himself, a man who simply planned them. Like a spider resting at the center of an enormous web, Moriarty felt every movement within his network. And now, after years of searching, Sherlock Holmes had finally reached the heart of that web. The problem was that Moriarty knew it. As Holmes continued his account, I began to understand why he regarded Professor Moriarty as a threat, unlike any other. Most criminals sought wealth, revenge, or power. They acted openly enough to leave traces behind. Even the cleverest among them eventually made mistakes. Moriarty was different. According to Holmes, the professor rarely appeared anywhere near the crimes he controlled. He remained distant, hidden behind layers of intermediaries and trusted agents. If a jewel disappeared, another man carried it away. If secret documents vanished, another hand performed the theft. If violence became necessary, someone else delivered the blow. Moriarty himself remained untouched. His genius lay not in committing crimes, but in organizing them. Holmes described him as the center of a vast web that stretched across London and beyond. Every strand connected to another criminal, another scheme, another secret operation. The people within that web often knew only their small part of the larger plan. Many had never even met the man who controlled them. That made the organization nearly impossible to destroy. When one criminal was arrested, others simply took his place. When one scheme failed, another began elsewhere. The web survived because its center remained hidden. For years, Holmes had searched for proof. He had followed trails through gambling houses, forgery rings, blackmail schemes, and thefts involving enormous sums of money. Again and again, the evidence pointed toward the same invisible hand. Yet proof strong enough for a court remained frustratingly out of reach. Then, at last, Moriarty made a mistake. Only a small one, Holmes admitted. The sort of mistake that no ordinary investigator would ever notice. But Sherlock Holmes was not an ordinary investigator. He seized upon that single weakness and followed it relentlessly. From that moment onward, the balance of power began to change. Patiently, he built his case. Documents were collected. Witnesses were identified. Connections were mapped. Bit by bit, the hidden empire of crime became visible. And now, after months of dangerous work, Holmes believed the end was finally within reach. In only a few days, police officers across London would move against Moriarty's organization. Thousands of criminals would be arrested. Years of unsolved crimes would finally be explained. The great web would be torn apart, but there was one problem. The spider at its center had already realized what Holmes was doing. And a man like Moriarty would never wait quietly for the trap to close around him. As Holmes spoke, I began to realize how much had been hidden from the public eye. London continued its ordinary life, unaware that a silent conflict was nearing its conclusion. Carriages rolled through the streets. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Policemen walked their familiar beats. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, Holmes had spent months preparing a trap for the most dangerous criminal organization in Europe. The plan was now almost complete. According to Holmes, only a few more days remained before the authorities would act. When the moment arrived, police officers would move against key members of Moriarty's network all at once. The operation had been carefully arranged so that no warning could spread through the organization before the arrests began. If everything went according to plan, years of criminal activity would finally come to an end. Holmes spoke of the matter calmly, but I could sense the immense effort that had brought him to this point. Few people understood how much patience his work required. The public imagined dramatic chases and sudden revelations. The reality was often far different. Success usually depended upon countless hours of observation, careful reasoning, and an almost endless attention to detail. In this case, Holmes had devoted every ounce of his energy to the task. He described the struggle as a contest between two minds. Whenever he moved closer to Moriarty, the professor shifted his position. Whenever he uncovered one secret, another obstacle appeared. The contest had continued for months without either side gaining a decisive advantage. But now, Holmes believed he finally held the upper hand. The evidence had been gathered. The authorities were prepared. The web was surrounded. Only the final move remained. Yet, instead of satisfaction, I detected something darker in Holmes's expression. The closer victory approached, the greater the danger became. A desperate enemy could be more dangerous than a confident one, and Moriarty had every reason to be desperate. If the police succeeded, He would lose everything: his power, his wealth, his freedom, perhaps even his life. Holmes understood this perfectly. That was why he had come to see me that evening. Not because the battle was beginning, but because it was almost over, and in those final days, the professor would strike back with all the force he possessed. Somewhere in London, Moriarty was already making his preparations, and Sherlock Holmes knew that he himself would be the target. Holmes paused for a moment, his gaze fixed upon the lamp flame. The room had become strangely quiet. Outside, sounds of London seemed distant, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Then Holmes revealed the most remarkable part of his story. Earlier that very day, while sitting alone in his rooms at Baker Street, he had received an unexpected visitor. It was not a client seeking help. It was not a police inspector bringing information. It was Professor James Moriarty himself. The meeting had taken place without warning. One moment, Holmes had been reviewing the final details of his case. The next, the most dangerous criminal in Europe stood inside his room. Even Holmes admitted that the appearance of the professor surprised him, not because he feared him, but because the visit revealed something important. Moriarty knew exactly what was happening. He knew that Holmes had uncovered his secrets. He knew that the net was closing around his organization, and most importantly, he knew who was responsible. The image remained vivid in my mind as Holmes described it. A tall, thin man, a pale face shaped by years of study, sharp eyes that missed very little, an appearance more suited to a university professor than the leader of a criminal empire. Nothing about him suggested violence. Nothing about him suggested murder. That was precisely what made him so dangerous. His greatest weapon was not strength, it was intelligence. According to Holmes, the professor spoke with remarkable calmness. There were no threats shouted in anger, no displays of emotion. Instead, he discussed the situation almost as though two scholars were debating a difficult problem. Yet, beneath that calm surface lay something cold and ruthless. Moriarty had not come to negotiate. He had come to deliver a warning. The message was simple: abandon the investigation. Step away from the case. Allow the organization to survive. If Holmes agreed, the conflict could end peacefully. If he refused, consequences would follow. Holmes listened without hesitation. The answer had already been decided, long before the professor entered the room. Months of work could not be abandoned. Too many crimes had gone unpunished. Too many victims deserved justice. So Holmes stood firm. The struggle would continue. As the meeting drew to a close, Moriarty's warning became unmistakably clear. The contest between them had reached its final stage. Soon one of them would emerge victorious. The other would be destroyed. And as the professor departed Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes understood that every remaining hour would be filled with danger. As Holmes described the end of his meeting with Professor Moriarty, I could see that the encounter had left a deeper impression upon him than he cared to admit. The professor had departed calmly. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, no open declaration of war. Yet Holmes regarded the meeting the one of the gravest moments of his career, for he had looked directly into the mind of the man he had pursued for so long. Moriarty was not driven by anger. He was not reckless. He was not the sort of criminal who acted from emotion. Every decision he made was calculated. Every move served a purpose. And now that his organization faced destruction, Holmes knew exactly how such a man would respond. He would remove the obstacle standing in his way. That obstacle was Sherlock Holmes. The professor's warning had been delivered politely, but its meaning was unmistakable. If Holmes continued his pursuit, his life would be in danger. Many men would have been shaken by such a threat. Some would have withdrawn. Others might have sought protection from the authorities. But Holmes was not inclined toward retreat. The more dangerous the challenge, the more determined he became. Still, he was not foolish enough to underestimate his opponent. As he explained the situation to me, I realized that he fully expected an attempt upon his life. In fact, he seemed almost certain of it. The only uncertainty was when and how the attack would come. That afternoon had already provided several alarming examples. After leaving Baker Street, Holmes had gone into London on business connected to the case. Before long, strange incidents began occurring around him. Individually, they might have appeared accidental. Taken together, they formed a pattern too obvious to ignore. Someone was trying to eliminate him, someone with considerable resources, someone capable of arranging events from a distance. As Holmes recounted these experiences, his bruised hand suddenly took on greater significance. Those injuries were not merely evidence of a scuffle. They were proof that the battle had already begun. Moriarty had made his decision. The time for warnings was over. The time for action had arrived. And somewhere, in the vast city beyond my window, unseen enemies were already moving into position. The hunter and the hunted were now locked in a contest from which neither could easily escape. Only one question remained: who would strike first? As I listened to Holmes that evening, I began to understand the extraordinary danger surrounding him. The threat from Professor Moriarty was no longer theoretical. It had already become terrifyingly real. Holmes believed that before the day was over, several attempts had been made upon his life. The first occurred shortly after he left Baker Street. He had been walking through a busy part of London, surrounded by the usual crowds of pedestrians, carriages, and delivery wagons. Nothing appeared unusual. The streets seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet, as Holmes approached crossing, disaster almost struck. Without warning, a large horse-drawn vehicle came racing around a corner at tremendous speed. The driver appeared to have lost all control. The wagon thundered directly toward Holmes. Only his quick reflexes saved him. In the final instant, he leapt out of its path. The vehicle missed him by the narrowest of margins and disappeared into the traffic before anyone could stop it. To a casual observer, it might have looked like an accident. Holmes was not convinced. Later that same day, another incident followed. As he walked along a different street, something crashed onto the pavement only a few feet away. A heavy brick had fallen from above. The impact shattered it into fragments. Had it struck him directly, the consequences could have been fatal. The explanation offered afterward seemed innocent enough. Repairs were being carried out on a nearby building. Workers had stacked materials upon the roof. Perhaps one brick had simply slipped, yet Holmes found the timing difficult to accept. 2 near-fatal accidents within a few hours were already suspicious. Then came the third attack. Unlike the others, this one left no room for doubt. A violent man, armed with a club, suddenly confronted him. The assault was direct and unmistakable. Holmes defended himself successfully and escaped serious injury, but not before receiving the bruises upon his hand that I had noticed earlier. 3 opportunities for disaster. 3 different methods, and yet Holmes believed they all originated from the same source. The pattern was too clear. Moriarty had begun his campaign. The professor himself remained safely hidden, far from the danger, but his agents were everywhere, watching, waiting, ready to act. And as Holmes calmly reviewed the events of that day, I realized something chilling. If these were only the opening moves, far worse was still to come. The more Holmes described the events of that day, the more uneasy I became. For years I had admired his ability to remain calm under pressure. Yet now I could see that he was measuring every step, every movement, every possibility, not because he lacked courage, because he understood the scale of the danger. Professor Moriarty was no ordinary adversary. He commanded resources that stretched across London and beyond. Men were willing to obey his orders without question. Some worked for money, others from fear. Many likely had no idea who truly directed them. To strike at such an organization was to challenge an unseen army, and Sherlock Holmes stood at the center of that conflict. For a few moments he sat silently, studying the smoke from his cigarette as it drifted toward the ceiling. Then he turned his attention to me. What he said next surprised me greatly. He wanted me to leave England with him, not for a day, not for a brief holiday. He proposed that we travel to the continent and remain away until the final arrests had been completed. At first, the suggestion seemed strange. Holmes was not a man who enjoyed leisure travel. He rarely took holidays, and even when he did, his thoughts usually returned to some problem demanding investigation. Yet his reasoning soon became clear. The police already possessed most of the evidence they needed. The machinery of the law was moving forward. In only a matter of days, the operation against Moriarty's network would begin. Until then, Holmes believed his safest course was to disappear. If Moriarty could not find him, the professor's final desperate efforts might fail. I considered the proposal carefully. My medical practice was quiet enough to allow a temporary absence. A trusted colleague could attend to urgent matters while I was away. More importantly, I could not imagine abandoning Holmes at such a moment. We had faced danger together before. To leave him now would have felt unthinkable. The decision was easy. I agreed to accompany him. For the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared upon Holmes's face. Yet, even then, the tension did not leave him. The journey ahead would require caution. Every detail mattered. Every movement had to be planned, for Moriarty's eyes were everywhere. And before dawn arrived, Holmes would give me a set of instructions unlike any I had ever received from him before. Once I had agreed to accompany him, Holmes leaned forward and spoke with unusual seriousness. Every trace of fatigue seemed to vanish from his face. In its place was the focused expression I had often seen when he was preparing for an important operation. The success of our escape, he explained, would depend upon absolute precision. Moriarty's agents were likely watching more than just Baker Street. They might be observing railway stations, hotels, and even the homes of those known to be associated with Holmes. That included me. For this reason, nothing could be left to chance. Holmes instructed me to prepare my luggage that very evening. However, I was not to take it personally to the station. Instead, it would be sent ahead by a trusted messenger. The fewer connections between myself and our departure, the better. His next instructions were even stranger. When I left home the following morning, I was to hire a cab with great care. Not the first one available, not even the second. Only after rejecting both was I to choose another. The request seemed excessive, yet Holmes insisted upon it. He believed that certain vehicles might already be under observation. Once inside the cab, I was to travel to a specific point in London. There, without hesitation, I would leave the vehicle and pass through a busy arcade. Timing would be important. Every minute had been calculated. At the far end of the arcade, another carriage would be waiting. A particular carriage, driven by a particular coachman. I was to enter it immediately and ask no questions. Only then would I continue to Victoria Station. As Holmes outlined the plan, I was struck by the extraordinary lengths he considered necessary. It sounded less like the departure of two travelers and more like a military operation behind enemy lines. Yet he spoke with complete confidence. He had clearly considered every possible danger, every route, every weakness, every opportunity for Moriarty's agents to interfere. When he finally finished, I asked where we would meet. His answer was simple: at the railway station. A reserved compartment would be waiting. There we would begin our journey out of England. The plan seemed elaborate, even excessive. But as I looked at Holmes's bruised hand and remembered the attacks he had already survived, I understood why such precautions were necessary. The game had entered its final stage, and somewhere in London, Professor Moriarty was already preparing his next move. Although Holmes had carefully explained the plan, I still hoped he might remain at my house for the night. The streets were dangerous. His enemies were searching for him. Surely it would be safer to stay indoors until morning. But Holmes immediately rejected the idea. He believed that anyone sheltering him might become a target. The fewer people connected to his movements, the safer they would be. It was typical of him to think first of others. Even while his own life was in danger, he was concerned about protecting those around him. Our conversation soon turned to practical matters. We reviewed the travel arrangements once more, ensuring that every detail was understood. Holmes repeated several instructions, emphasizing that no deviation was acceptable. His caution might have seemed excessive to another man. To me, it was evidence of how seriously he viewed the threat. At last, he rose from his chair. The hour had grown late. The room was quiet, except for the faint kicking foggy and the distant sounds of London beyond the shuttered windows. For a moment, I studied my old friend. He appeared calm, yet there was something different about him that evening. Perhaps it was the knowledge that he was approaching the climax of a struggle which had consumed so much of his energy. Or perhaps it was the realization that he was facing an opponent unlike any he had ever encountered before. Whatever the reason, I found myself feeling strangely uneasy, as though events were moving toward an outcome neither of us could fully foresee. Together, we stepped into the garden behind the house. The night air was cool. Dark shadows stretched between the walls and fences, turning even familiar surroundings into uncertain shapes. Holmes glanced around carefully before approaching the far wall. Without hesitation, he climbed over it and dropped into the neighboring street beyond. The movement was swift and practiced. A moment later, I heard the distant sound of a cab being summoned. Then silence returned. I remained standing in the garden for several moments after he had gone. An odd feeling settled over me. It seemed impossible that a man of Holmes's abilities could be forced into hiding, yet that was exactly what had happened. Somewhere in the darkness, Professor Moriarty's vast network was searching for him, and as I finally returned indoors, one thought remained fixed in my mind. By this time tomorrow we would be fleeing England together. If Moriarty intended to stop us, the next few hours would be his last opportunity. I slept very little that night. My thoughts continually returned to Holmes and the dangers surrounding him. Every detail of our conversation replayed itself in my mind. The attacks, the warnings, the mysterious Professor Moriarty, all combined into a picture that was difficult to ignore. By morning, I was determined to follow Holmes's instructions exactly. After breakfast, I arranged for my luggage to be sent ahead as planned. Then I prepared for my own departure. The process felt strangely unnatural. Ordinarily, A journey began with simple arrangements and little concern. This time, every movement seemed connected to a larger strategy. I carefully followed Holmes's directions regarding the cab. The first available vehicle was ignored, so was the second. Only then did I select another and begin my journey across London. The city appeared much as it always had. People hurried along the pavements. Shopkeepers attended to their businesses. Clerks and laborers moved through the streets with little awareness of the drama unfolding around them. Yet I found myself studying every face. Every passing carriage seemed worthy of suspicion. Had Holmes's concerns influenced me so deeply, or were unseen eyes truly watching? Soon I reached the location he had specified. Without delay, I paid the driver and entered the crowded arcade. The passage was filled with shoppers and travelers, and I moved through them as quickly as possible. Holmes had stressed the importance of timing. I had no intention of disappointing him. Emerging at the far end, I immediately spotted the waiting carriage. Everything was exactly as he had described. The coachman sat motionless, wrapped in a dark cloak. Without exchanging unnecessary words, I climbed inside. At once, the carriage pulled away. The journey to Victoria Station passed without incident, yet I remained uneasy. Holmes's elaborate precautions suggested that danger might appear at any moment. Still, no pursuers revealed themselves. No attacks occurred. The streets rolled by peacefully. Eventually, the great railway station came into view. For the first time that morning, I felt a measure of relief. Surely the most difficult part of the plan was behind us. Soon I would find Holmes waiting in the reserved compartment, and together we would leave England behind. Yet, as I stepped onto the busy platform and searched the crowd, a troubling realization struck me. Sherlock Holmes was nowhere to be seen, and with every passing minute, my anxiety began to grow. Victoria Station was crowded with travelers. Porters hurried along the platform with carts piled high with luggage. Families exchanged farewells. Railway officials moved between carriages, making their final preparations before departure. Amid all this activity, I searched anxiously for Sherlock Holmes. According to our arrangement, he was to meet me there. The train would soon depart, yet there was no sign of him. I walked the length of the platform more than once, scanning every face that passed before me. Each minute increased my unease. The possibility that Holmes had been delayed seemed unlikely. Punctuality was one of his habits. The possibility that he had altered the plan without warning seemed equally doubtful. A far more troubling explanation forced its way into my thoughts. Had Moriarty finally succeeded? The idea was so disturbing that I tried to dismiss it at once. Yet Holmes had openly admitted that his enemies were closing in around him. If they had discovered his movements during the night, almost anything was possible. The station clock continued its relentless progress toward departure. Passengers were taking their seats. Porters were closing compartment doors. Still, Holmes did not appear. Eventually, I located the reserved carriage he had mentioned the previous evening. My luggage had already been placed aboard, and the compartment stood ready for our journey. Reluctantly, I entered and took my seat. The empty place opposite me only deepened my concern. For several minutes, I remained there, watching the platform through the window and hoping to catch sight of Holmes's familiar figure. Instead, my attention was drawn to an elderly clergyman who entered the compartment shortly before departure. He appeared tired and somewhat confused by the activity around him. His clothing was worn from travel, and his English seemed limited. A railway porter helped settle his luggage before leaving him seated across from me. Under ordinary circumstances, I might have offered conversation. That morning my thoughts were elsewhere. I scarcely noticed the old man after he sat down. My entire attention remained fixed upon the platform outside. The final moments before departure arrived. Doors slammed shut. A whistle echoed through the station. The train shuddered gently as the engine prepared to move. My heart sank. Holmes had not come. For the first time since our adventure began, genuine fear took hold of me. Then, just as the train started to roll forward, a familiar voice spoke quietly from across the compartment, a voice I knew better than almost any other in the world. And what happened next was so astonishing that for a moment I could scarcely believe my own eyes. The train had already begun to move, slowly at first. Then, with increasing speed, the platform started to slide past the windows. I felt a heavy sense of dread. Sherlock Holmes had not appeared. Every plan we had made seemed to be unraveling before my eyes. Then a voice spoke from the seat opposite me. "My dear Watson." The words were quiet, almost amused, yet were instantly recognizable. I turned in astonishment. The elderly clergyman who had been sitting across from me was looking directly at me. For a brief moment, I could only stare. Then before my eyes, the transformation began. The tired expression vanished. The drooping posture straightened. The dull gaze sharpened into one of remarkable intelligence. It was as though an entirely different person had emerged from beneath the disguise. Sherlock Holmes smiled. I confess that I was so startled that I nearly cried out aloud. Even after years of friendship, his talent for disguise remained astonishing. The old priest had been Holmes all along. He seemed highly satisfied by my reaction. The disguise, he explained, had been necessary. The station had almost certainly been under observation. If Moriarty's agents had recognized him before the train departed, our escape might have ended before it truly began. Only by becoming someone entirely different had he managed to reach the carriage unnoticed. As Holmes removed portions of the disguise and packed them away, his expression remained serious. The danger was far from over. In fact, he believed it was only beginning. Then he directed my attention toward the platform outside. Although the train was already gathering speed, one figure remained clearly visible among the crowd. A tall man was forcing his way through the departing passengers. His movements were urgent and determined. Even at a distance, there was something unmistakably dangerous about him. The man reached the edge of the platform and raised an arm as though attempting to stop the train. But it was too late. The gap between us widened rapidly. Within moments, he was left behind. Holmes watched him calmly. Then he nodded once. There was no doubt in his mind. The man we had seen was Professor Moriarty. He had arrived only seconds too late. For the moment, at least, we had escaped him. But Holmes' expression suggested little satisfaction. He knew his enemy too well. A man like Moriarty would not abandon the pursuit simply because he had missed one train. If anything, the chase was only beginning. And somewhere behind us, the most dangerous criminal in Europe was already planning his next move. For several moments after the train left Victoria Station, neither Holmes nor I spoke. The image of Professor Moriarty remained fresh in my mind. I could still see the tall figure on the platform, pushing through the crowd in a final attempt to reach us. Had he arrived only a minute earlier, events might have unfolded very differently. Yet Holmes seemed remarkably calm, finished packing away the last pieces of his disguise, and settled comfortably into his seat. To an observer, he might have appeared to be a traveler beginning an ordinary journey. I knew better. His mind was already several moves ahead. As the countryside began to replace the streets of London outside our window, I remarked that we had surely escaped our pursuers. After all, the train was moving rapidly toward the coast. The departure had been successful. Moriarty had missed his chance. Holmes smiled faintly. It was the sort of smile he often displayed when he believed someone had overlooked an important detail. In his opinion, our situation remained far from secure. Professor Moriarty was not a man who accepted defeat so easily. The fact that he had failed once would not discourage him. Instead, it would force him to become even more determined. Holmes reminded me that the professor possessed immense resources. Money, influence, and loyal agents were available to him at a moment's notice. A missed train was merely an inconvenience, nothing more. If Holmes himself had been the pursuer, he explained, he would already be considering alternative methods, different routes, different trains, different opportunities. The pursuit would continue without hesitation, and if Holmes could predict his own actions, he could also predict Moriarty's. That realization troubled me greatly. We had barely begun our journey, yet Holmes was already convinced that our enemy remained close behind. The contest between them had become almost like a game of chess played across an entire continent. Each move demanded a response. Each decision created new possibilities. Neither player could afford a mistake. As I listened, I began to appreciate the extraordinary nature of their struggle. This was no longer merely a criminal investigation. It had become a duel between two exceptional minds. One represented the law, the other represented organized crime. Both understood the other's methods. Both anticipated the other's plans. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Holmes believed Moriarty was already preparing a countermove. The question was not whether he would continue the chase. The question was how soon he would catch up to us. As the train sped through the English countryside, I began to feel a measure of relief. The fields rolled past in shades of green and gold. Villages appeared and vanished beyond the windows, and for a brief time the dangers of London seemed far away. Holmes, however, remained vigilant. His eyes occasionally drifted toward the passing landscape, but I knew he was thinking not about the scenery before us, but about the man pursuing us. Professor Moriarty occupied his thoughts as completely as any case I had ever witnessed. At length, Holmes leaned forward and spoke quietly. He had been considering our next move. The original plan had been simple enough. We would continue to the coast, cross the channel, and proceed toward the continent, but circumstances had changed. The sight of Moriarty at Victoria Station confirmed something important. The professor knew exactly where we were headed. He had not lost our trail. He was following it. That fact altered everything. Holmes explained that a predictable route was now a dangerous route. If Moriarty expected us to continue our journey without interruption, then that was precisely what we should avoid. The best defense against a brilliant opponent was unpredictability, a sudden change, a move that disrupted expectations, a move that forced the pursuer to guess. As he outlined his reasoning, I was once again reminded why Holmes had remained undefeated for so many years. He did not simply react to events. He anticipated them. Every possibility was examined before it occurred. Every risk was weighed. Every decision formed part of a larger strategy. Soon we would reach Canterbury. Most passengers regarded it as an ordinary stop along the line. To Holmes, it represented an opportunity. There, he intended to abandon our current route entirely. Instead of continuing as expected, we would disappear in another direction. The change would cost us time and convenience. Our luggage, already proceeding ahead, might be temporarily lost to us. But such concerns meant little, compared with the advantage of confusing our enemy. I looked out the window as the train rushed onward. The landscape appeared peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface, an invisible contest continued. Somewhere behind us, Moriarty was calculating his next move, and somewhere ahead, Holmes was preparing his own. Very soon, one of those calculations would prove correct, the other would fail, and the chase would enter an even more dangerous phase. When our train finally arrived at Canterbury, Holmes wasted no time. The moment we stepped onto the platform, he guided me away from the other passengers and toward a position where we could observe the railway line without attracting attention. At first, I was uncertain what he hoped to see. The station appeared perfectly ordinary. Travelers moved about their business. Porters wheeled carts loaded with luggage. Railway officials called instructions to one another. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet Holmes watched the tracks with intense concentration. His eyes never left the direction from which we had come. Minutes passed. Then, far in the distance, a thin column of smoke appeared above the trees. Holmes immediately straightened. "There," he said quietly. The smoke grew larger. Soon the sound of an approaching engine reached us. What followed was unlike anything I had expected. A train was racing toward the station at remarkable speed. It was not part of the regular timetable. There were no passenger carriages stretching behind it. Instead, there was only a locomotive pulling a single carriage. Even to my untrained eye, it looked unusual. Holmes seemed entirely unsurprised. In fact, he appeared almost satisfied. The train thundered past us with a roar, sending hot air and smoke sweeping across the platform. Within moments, it vanished down the line. Only then did Holmes explain. Professor Moriarty, believed, had hired a special train. The professor had arrived too late to catch our departure from London, but he possessed both the wealth and influence necessary to arrange another solution. Rather than accept defeat, he had simply created his own train and continued the pursuit. The realization was deeply unsettling. Most men would have abandoned the chase. Most criminals would have fled. Moriarty had done neither. Instead, he was following us with relentless determination. What disturbed me most was how accurately Holmes had predicted the move. Before the special train appeared, he had already anticipated exactly what his enemy would do. It was as though the two men shared the same method of reasoning. Each understood how the other thought. Each could see several moves ahead. The sight of that single carriage convinced me that Holmes had been correct all along. We had not escaped. Not truly. The distance between hunter and hunted had merely changed. Somewhere ahead, Moriarty was still searching for us. And somewhere behind him, the law was closing around the criminal empire he had spent years building. The final confrontation seemed inevitable. The only uncertainty was where it would happen. The appearance of the special train left a profound impression upon me. Until that moment, part of me had hoped that Holmes might be exaggerating the danger. The situation seemed extraordinary, almost unbelievable. Now there could be no doubt. Professor Moriarty was pursuing us with a determination that bordered on obsession. The sight of that lone carriage racing along the tracks proved how far he was willing to go. Holmes, however, appeared almost pleased, not because the pursuit continued, but because the special train confirmed his calculations. Once again, he had predicted his opponent correctly. To Holmes, every accurate prediction revealed something valuable about the mind he was facing. We'll soon abandon our original route entirely. Instead of continuing as expected, we began a complicated journey that would take us across different towns and the railway lines. The purpose was simple: confusion. If Moriarty believed he knew our destination, Holmes intended to make that knowledge worthless. The following hours became a blur of travel. Stations came and went. Trains were boarded and left behind. Routes changed unexpectedly. Even I occasionally struggled to remember our exact course. Yet Holmes remained calm throughout. He seemed to carry an invisible map inside his mind, always aware of where we were and where we needed to go next. Eventually, we crossed the channel and reached the continent. For many travelers, such a crossing would have marked the beginning of a holiday. For us, it felt more like the next stage of an escape. Every crowded platform attracted Holmes's attention. Every unfamiliar face received a brief but careful examination. Though he rarely spoke of it, I knew he was searching constantly for signs of pursuit. And yet, despite the danger, there were moments when the tension eased. The landscapes became unfamiliar and beautiful. Ancient towns appeared beyond railway windows. Wide rivers reflected the afternoon sunlight. For short periods, it was possible to imagine that we were simply travelers exploring Europe together. But those peaceful moments never lasted long. Sooner or later, Holmes's eyes would drift toward a passing stranger or a distant figure on a platform, and I would remember the truth. Professor Moriarty was still out there, somewhere beyond our sight, still searching, still calculating, still determined to finish the contest he had begun. And with every mile we traveled, I sensed that both men were being drawn toward a final meeting from which neither could easily turn away. Several days passed as Holmes and I continued our journey across Europe. Though we changed routes frequently and avoided predictable patterns, the sense of pursuit never completely disappeared. Yet there was another concern weighing heavily upon Holmes's mind: the operation in London. Months of work had been invested in gathering evidence against Moriarty's organization. Police officers were preparing to act. Arrests were expected at any moment. Everything depended upon timing. If the authorities moved successfully, the criminal network would collapse. If they failed, years of effort could be lost. During our travels, Holmes sent messages whenever possible, seeking updates from England. Outwardly, he remained composed, but I knew he was waiting anxiously for news. At last, while we were staying in a hotel on the continent, a telegram arrived. Holmes opened it immediately. The moment his eyes scanned the message, his expression changed. For an instant, I thought disaster had struck. Then came a reaction I had rarely witnessed from him: genuine frustration. He lowered the telegram and stared silently into space. The news was both a success and a failure. The police had acted. The great operation had gone forward exactly as planned. Across London, members of Moriarty's organization had been arrested. Evidence had been seized. Long-hidden crimes were finally being connected to those responsible. Years of criminal activity were beginning to unravel. Yet one crucial figure had escaped: Professor Moriarty himself. The architect of the entire organization had slipped through the net. The revelation cast a shadow over everything. Without their leader, the gang had suffered a devastating blow. Many would face trial. Many would spend years behind bars. But Moriarty remained free. And a free Moriarty was more dangerous than ever. His empire had been destroyed, his influence shattered, his carefully constructed web torn apart. Only one thing remained to him: revenge. Holmes understood this immediately. The professor no longer had an organization to protect, no fortune to preserve, no criminal network to manage. All of it had been taken away. In Moriarty's eyes, one man was responsible: Sherlock Holmes. As evening settled outside our hotel window, Holmes folded the telegram and placed it carefully into his pocket. The battle in London was over, but another battle had just begun. Somewhere on the continent of Europe, a hunted criminal was moving through the shadows. and he had only a single objective left: to find Sherlock Holmes before Sherlock Holmes found him. After receiving the telegram, Holmes became even more watchful than before. The destruction of Moriarty's criminal empire should have been a cause for celebration. Hundreds of victims will finally see justice. Years of hidden wrongdoing had been exposed. Yet Holmes took little satisfaction from the victory. He understood something that few others could. A desperate man is often more dangerous than a powerful one. Professor Moriarty had lost everything. His organization was shattered. His trusted associates were being arrested. The future he had spent years building had collapsed in a matter of days. For most men, such a defeat would have meant surrender. Moriarty was not most men. According to Holmes, the professor possessed an extraordinary ability to focus his entire mind upon a single objective. Now that objective was no longer wealth or influence. It was revenge. As we continued our travels, I noticed that Holmes rarely allowed himself a moment of carelessness. At railway stations, he studied arriving passengers before boarding. At hotels, he inspected entrances and exits. During walks through unfamiliar towns, his eyes constantly moved from face to face. To an observer, such behavior might have appeared excessive. I knew better. He was preparing for an enemy who excelled at remaining unseen. One afternoon, while we crossed a quiet region of the countryside, I asked whether he truly believed Moriarty was still following us. Holmes considered the question carefully. Then he admitted something that sent a chill through me. He did not merely suspect it, he was certain of it. Somewhere behind us the professor was moving along the same roads, boarding the same trains, and gathering the same information. The distance separating hunter and hunted might change from day to day, but the pursuit itself had never ended. A traveler reading a newspaper, a man standing alone on a station platform, a figure disappearing around a street corner. Any one of them could be connected to Moriarty. Any one of them might be carrying information back to him. Yet, despite the danger, Holmes remained surprisingly cheerful. At times, he even seemed energized by the challenge. Perhaps he sensed that the struggle was nearing its conclusion. Perhaps he understood that the long contest between himself and Moriarty could not continue indefinitely. One way or another, it would soon end. And as we journeyed deeper into Europe, the shadow behind us seemed to grow closer with every passing day. As the days passed, Holmes and I traveled steadily eastward through some of the most beautiful landscapes I had ever seen. Spring had arrived in the valleys. Green meadows stretched across the countryside, dotted with small villages and wooden cottages. Rivers sparkled beneath the sunlight, and distant church bells drifted through the clear mountain air. To most travelers, it would have seemed a peaceful journey. For us, however, a sense of danger accompanied every step. The closer we moved toward the Swiss Alps, the more I became aware of Holmes' constant vigilance. He never complained. He never appeared frightened. Yet, he never relaxed. Even while admiring the scenery, part of his attention remained fixed upon the possibility of pursuit. One evening, while we rested at a small inn, I asked whether he regretted becoming involved in the struggle against Moriarty. After all, the case had cost him months of effort and placed his life in extraordinary danger. Holmes reflected quietly before answering. His response revealed much about his character. He explained that there were certain criminals whose actions affected far more than a handful of victims. Such individuals poisoned society itself. Their influence spread outward, encouraging countless other crimes. If men like Moriarty remained unchallenged, entire systems of corruption could flourish beneath the surface of civilization. That, Holmes believed, made the risk worthwhile. Listening to him, I realized that the contest had never been merely personal. It was not a battle of pride. It was not about proving was cleverer. For Holmes, the struggle had always been about removing a dangerous force from the world, and, despite everything that had happened, he remained convinced that he had made the correct choice. The next stage of our journey carried us deeper into the mountains. Towering peaks rose above us, their upper slopes still covered in snow. The roads became narrower, the air grew colder and fresher. Every turn seemed to reveal another breathtaking view. Yet beneath the beauty lurked an uneasy feeling I could not entirely dismiss. The mountains felt isolated, remote, far removed from the crowded cities we had left behind. If danger came here, help would not be close at hand. Perhaps Holmes sensed the same thing. For as we continued onward through the winding passes, I noticed that his eyes remained fixed upon the road behind us almost as often as the road ahead. And somewhere beyond those mountains, I could not help feeling that Professor Moriarty was still following our trail. Our route through Switzerland led us higher into the Alps. The scenery became increasingly magnificent. Snow-covered peaks rose like great white walls against the sky, while deep valleys stretched below us, green with the first signs of spring. The contrast was remarkable. Winter still ruled the mountains above, while summer seemed to be awakening in the world beneath. For a time, the journey felt almost peaceful. The villages were quiet. The air was fresh and clear. Even Holmes appeared more relaxed than he had been for many days. Yet I knew better than to mistake his calmness for carelessness. The shadow of Moriarty still hung over us. One afternoon, we crossed a lonely mountain pass beside a cold alpine lake. The water was dark and perfectly still, reflecting the towering cliffs that surrounded it. Few travelers were upon the road. The silence of the place was almost complete. As we walked, Holmes suddenly paused and glanced behind us. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. The rocky slopes rose steeply above the path. Beyond them, only sky. For several moments he remained motionless, studying the heights with great attention. Then he resumed walking without explanation. A short time later, the incident occurred. Without warning, a tremendous crash echoed across the mountains. A massive stone came hurtling down from the cliffs above. The sound was terrifying. The rock bounced and rolled down the steep slope, gathering speed as it descended. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire mountainside might collapse. The great stone struck the ground behind us with enormous force before continuing onward and plunging into the lake below. Water exploded upward in the shower of spray. The peaceful silence was shattered. Our guide immediately assured us that such events were common in the mountains. As snow melted during the spring, rocks often became loosened and fell naturally from the heights. His explanation sounded reasonable. Indeed, I might have accepted it, without question. But Holmes did not. I noticed him studying the ridge above us long after the guide had finished speaking. There was no fear in his expression, only calculation, only thought. At last he turned away and continued along the path. Yet a faint smile appeared upon his face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a man whose suspicions have been confirmed. That evening, when I asked whether he believed the falling stone had truly been an accident, Holmes gave no direct answer. Instead, he looked toward the darkening mountains and spoke quietly. "Some dangers, Watson, have a habit of following us wherever we go." And as night settled over the Alps, I found myself wondering whether Moriarty's reach extended even into these lonely mountains. After the incident in the mountains, our journey continued through Switzerland. The roads wound between towering cliffs and deep valleys, carrying us farther from the crowded cities of Europe. Everywhere we looked, nature seemed vast and untouched. Yet, despite the beauty around us, I could not completely forget the falling stone. The memory lingered in my thoughts. Had it truly been an accident, or had it been something else? Holmes offered no clear answer. Indeed, he rarely spoke about Moriarty, unless the subject became unavoidable. Instead, he seemed unusually thoughtful during the days that followed. At times we would walk for long stretches without exchanging a word. Far from appearing troubled, however, Holmes seemed strangely content. There was a calmness about him that I found difficult to explain. One evening, as we rested outside a small mountain inn, the setting sun painted the snowy peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The scene was magnificent. For several minutes, Holmes simply watched the distant mountains. Then he began speaking about his life and career. It was not a topic he often discussed. Holmes had always preferred facts to personal reflections. Yet on that evening, he seemed willing to look back upon the years behind him. He spoke of the many investigations we had shared, the mysteries solved, the criminals brought to justice, the innocent lives protected from harm. There was no pride in his voice, only quiet satisfaction. Holmes believed that a person's value should be measured by the good they leave behind. By that standard, he felt he had little reason for regret. London, he remarked, was a safer place than it had been when he first began his work. Many dangerous men had been stopped. Many hidden threats had been exposed. If his efforts had contributed to that result, then his time had been well spent. And yet they carried the tone of someone taking stock of his life, someone reviewing a long journey before reaching its destination. Perhaps Holmes sensed my concern, for he quickly returned to lighter subjects. But the feeling remained with me. The mountains around us seemed vast and silent. The shadows lengthened across the valleys below, and for reasons I could not fully explain, I found myself wondering how much longer our extraordinary journey would continue. For somewhere beyond those distant peaks, destiny appeared to be drawing steadily closer. On the 3rd day of May, Holmes and I arrived at a small Swiss village, Meiringen. Nestled among towering mountains and surrounded by forests and rushing streams, it seemed a place untouched by the troubles of the outside world. The village was quiet and welcoming. Wooden houses stood beneath steep roofs, and narrow roads wound between gardens bright with spring flowers. Above everything rose the immense peaks of the Alps, their snowy summits shining beneath the afternoon sun. After weeks of travel and uncertainty, the peaceful atmosphere felt almost unreal. We took rooms at a local hotel, whose proprietor spoke excellent English. He had spent several years working in London and was eager to assist travelers from Britain. The man proved friendly and knowledgeable about the surrounding region. While discussing local sites, he strongly recommended that we visit a famous natural wonder nearby before continuing our journey. It was called the Reichenbach Falls. According to him, no traveler should pass through Meiringen without seeing it. The waterfall lay along the route we intended to follow the next day, making the suggestion convenient as well as appealing. Holmes agreed at once. Although many people associated him solely with crime and investigation, he possessed genuine appreciation for nature. Whenever circumstances allowed, he enjoyed observing landscapes with the same attention he devoted to mysteries. That evening, we dined quietly and discussed our plans. For the first time in many days, there seemed little immediate reason for concern. No suspicious figures had appeared. No messages had arrived. No evidence suggested thought Moriarty had discovered our exact location, yet even then, Holmes remained cautious. From time to time, I noticed his eyes drift toward the hotel entrance or the windows overlooking the street. Old habits were difficult to abandon, especially when the enemy was Professor Moriarty. As darkness settled over the village, I stepped outside for a few moments. The mountain air was cool and refreshing. Above me, countless stars filled the sky. The peaceful silence was broken only by the distant sound of rushing water somewhere in the darkness. It was difficult to imagine danger reaching such a place. Difficult to believe that the great conflict between Holmes and Moriarty could follow us into these remote mountains. And yet, as I looked toward the shadowed peaks surrounding Meiringen, I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. The journey was nearing its end. Of that, I was becoming increasingly certain. What I did not yet realize was that the most important day of our adventure was about to begin. The morning of May 4th dawned bright and clear. After breakfast, Holmes and I set out from Meiringen, with the intention of crossing the mountains toward another small village beyond the pass. Our route would take us near the famous Reichenbach Falls, which our hotel proprietor had so strongly recommended. The path climbed steadily upward, through forests and rocky slopes. The higher we went, the more impressive the scenery became. Sunlight illuminated the distant peaks, while streams, fed by melting snow, rushed down the mountainsides. The air was cool and wonderfully fresh. For a time, the journey felt almost carefree. Holmes appeared in excellent spirits. The tension that had followed him across Europe seemed lighter than before, and several times he paused simply to admire the landscape around us. At last, we reached the falls. Even now, years later, I struggle to describe them adequately. The Reichenbach was not merely a waterfall. It was a force of nature. A great torrent of water plunged into a deep abyss carved through black rock. Clouds of spray rose constantly from below, drifting upward like smoke from an enormous fire. The roar was deafening. The entire gorge seemed to tremble beneath the power of the rushing water. A narrow path had been cut into the mountainside to allow visitors a closer view. Following this route, Holmes and I approached the edge and looked down into the swirling depths below. The sight was both magnificent and unsettling. Far beneath us, white water crashed endlessly against dark stone before vanishing into the depths of the gorge. The spray drifted across the path, leaving the ground damp beneath our feet. For several minutes we stood silently, absorbed by the spectacle. The falls possessed a strange hypnotic quality. One could easily lose track of time while watching the endless movement of the water. At length, we turned to continue our journey. Neither of us knew that our plans were about to change. Neither of us suspected that fate had chosen this remote place as the stage for the final chapter, Sherlock Holmes's greatest case. The mountains stood silent around us. The waterfall thundered below, and somewhere nearby, unseen and waiting, another figure was drawing closer, a figure whose arrival would alter both our lives forever. Holmes and I had only just turned away from the Reichenbach Falls when an unexpected interruption occurred. A young Swiss messenger came hurrying along the mountain path toward us. The boy carried a letter and appeared anxious to deliver it as quickly as possible. When he reached us, he handed the envelope directly to me. I immediately recognized the hotel seal from Meiringen. Assuming it concerned some forgotten item or travel arrangement, I opened it without concern. The contents, however, changed everything. According to the message, an English lady had recently arrived at the hotel in a critically ill condition. She was said to be suffering from a severe lung disease and had become dangerously weak during her journey through Switzerland. The situation was described as urgent. The woman reportedly wished to see an English doctor and refused treatment from anyone else. The hotel proprietor personally appealed for my assistance. As I finished reading, my medical instincts responded immediately. The request seemed entirely reasonable. Seriously ill patient in a foreign country would naturally seek help from someone who spoke her language and understood her concerns. Moreover, if her condition was truly as grave as described, every moment could matter. Yet, despite the urgency of the appeal, I hesitated. Something about leaving Holmes at that particular moment made me uneasy. Perhaps it was the memory of Moriarty. Perhaps it was simply the strange feeling that had followed me throughout our journey. Whatever the reason, I found myself reluctant to depart. Holmes, however, saw no difficulty. The hotel was only a short distance away. He suggested that I return to Meiringen to tend to the patient and then rejoin him later in the day. Meanwhile, he would continue enjoying the scenery around the falls before proceeding along the mountain path toward our evening destination. The arrangement appeared perfectly sensible. The young Swiss messenger would remain with Holmes and act as a guide until my return. Reluctantly, I agreed. The duty of a physician could not easily be ignored. Before leaving, I exchanged a few final words with Holmes. He seemed calm and entirely unconcerned. Then I began the descent toward the village. After a short distance, I glanced back one final time. Holmes stood near the edge of the falls, his arms folded as he gazed into the swirling mist below. The roar of the water echoed through the mountains. The scene appeared peaceful. Yet as I continued down the path, an uneasy feeling settled over me. I could not know it then, but that brief glance over my shoulder would become one of the most important memories of my life. The descent to Meiringen occupied a little over an hour. Throughout the journey, my thoughts remained fixed upon the patient described in the letter. The request seemed genuine, and I hurried along the mountain path as quickly as conditions allowed. By the time I reached the village, I was eager to begin my medical examination. To my surprise, however, the proprietor of the hotel appeared puzzled when I mentioned the matter. At first, I assumed there had been some misunderstanding. Perhaps the lady had already departed. Perhaps her condition had changed. Yet as our conversation continued, a far more disturbing truth emerged. There was no English lady. No seriously ill patient had arrived at the hotel. No request for assistance had ever been sent. The proprietor stared at the letter in complete confusion. He insisted that he had not written it, nor had he authorized anyone else to do so. For a moment, I could scarcely comprehend what I was hearing. The words seemed impossible. I examined the letter again. The hotel seal was genuine. The handwriting appeared convincing. Everything about it had seemed authentic, and yet the entire message was a fabrication, a trap. The realization struck me with terrible force. Someone had deliberately lured me away from Holmes. Someone had arranged for us to be separated at precisely the moment when we were most vulnerable. Immediately, another memory surfaced in my mind. As I had descended from the falls, I had glanced back toward the mountain path. There had been a man, a dark figure moving rapidly upward in the direction of Holmes. At the time I had paid little attention. Now the image returned with frightening clarity. The unease I had felt throughout the day suddenly transformed into certainty. Something was terribly wrong. I demanded every detail the proprietor could provide. After some thought, he recalled that a tall English gentleman had appeared shortly after Holmes and I left the village. The stranger had asked questions. He had remained only briefly, And then he had disappeared. My blood ran cold. I no longer needed further explanations. The false letter, the mysterious visitor, the figure climbing toward the falls. All the pieces fit together with horrifying precision. Without waiting another moment, I turned and rushed from the hotel. The return journey seemed endless. Every minute felt unbearable. The mountain path that had taken me an hour to descend now became a desperate race against time. One dreadful thought echoed through my mind again and again. Professor Moriarty had finally made his move, and Sherlock Holmes was alone with him. Never in my life had I climbed a mountain path with such urgency. The peaceful beauty of the Swiss countryside had vanished completely from my awareness. The forests, the cliffs, the streams rushing down the slopes, all became little more than a blur as I hurried upward toward the Reichenbach Falls. My thoughts were filled with a single fear. I had left Sherlock Holmes alone, and somewhere ahead, Professor Moriarty was waiting. The further I climbed, the more dreadful my imagination became. I replayed every detail of the day again and again. The forged letter, the mysterious Englishman, the figure I had glimpsed on the path. Each piece now pointed toward the same conclusion. The separation had been carefully planned. Moriarty had not acted by chance. He had created an opportunity, and I had unknowingly helped him. The roar of the waterfall eventually reached my ears once more. Faint at first, then steadily louder. The sound echoed through the mountains, like distant thunder. At last the familiar path came into view. I hurried forward, scarcely able to breathe. The place appeared deserted. No voices, no movement, only the endless crashing of water below. Then I noticed something. Leaning against a rock near the viewpoint was Holmes's walking stick. My heart sank. The sight immediately told me that something was wrong. Holmes would never have abandoned it voluntarily. Call out his name. The mountains answered only with echoes. Again, I shouted. Again, there came no reply. The waterfall continued its relentless roar. I searched the area desperately. There was no sign of Holmes, no sign of the young Swiss guide, no sign of anyone at all. The narrow path stretched toward the edge of the falls and ended abruptly, exactly as I remembered. The place felt strangely abandoned, as though whatever had happened there had already concluded. Yet clues remained. The damp earth near the end of the path appeared disturbed. The ground showed signs of violent movement. Nearby plants had been crushed and torn. Several branches hung broken above the abyss. Slowly, dread settled over me. Years spent beside Holmes had taught me how to observe details, and the details before me painted a terrible picture. Two men had reached the end of that path. Only one outcome could explain the marks they had left behind. With growing horror, I moved closer to the edge and looked down into the swirling depths below. And what I saw there would haunt me for the rest of my life. The Reichenbach Falls thundered beneath me with terrible power. Clouds of spray rose from the depths of the gorge, drifting upward and soaking the rocks around the viewing path. The air itself seemed alive with mist and noise. I lay flat upon the ground and carefully looked over the edge. Far below, white water churned among black cliffs before vanishing into darkness. The drop was immense. The violence of the torrent made it impossible to imagine anyone surviving a fall into that dreadful abyss. For several moments I simply stared. Part of me still hoped that Holmes might appear from some hidden trail, that he followed another path, that there existed some explanation less terrible than the one forming in my mind. But the evidence around me told a different story. Years of working beside Sherlock Holmes had taught me how to read a scene. And now, with growing horror, I found myself using those lessons against my own wishes. The soft ground near the end of the path preserved several footprints. 2 sets of tracks were clearly visible. Both led toward the edge. Another returned. I examined them carefully. The marks ended near the disturbed earth and broken vegetation, overlooking the gorge. The signs of struggle were unmistakable. The soil had been torn up. Plants had been crushed beneath heavy movement. Several branches hung broken over the abyss. Everything suggested a violent confrontation. I closed my eyes for a moment. The conclusion seemed unavoidable. Moriarty had reached Holmes. The 2 men had met upon this isolated path. Here, beside one of the most dangerous waterfalls in Europe, the long conflict between them had finally come to an end. Yet even then, I refused to surrender completely to despair. There remained no bodies, no witnesses, no final proof, only silence, only clues, only the terrible absence left behind. As I searched the area once more, my gaze fell upon something glimmering atop a nearby rock. The object reflected a brief flash of light through the mist. At first, I paid little attention. Then I recognized it instantly. It was Holmes' silver cigarette case. The sight stopped me cold. Holmes rarely misplaced anything. If the case had been left behind, there had to be a reason. I stepped forward and picked it up carefully. As I did so, a folded piece of paper slipped from beneath it and fluttered onto the damp ground. My heart began to race. The paper had clearly been placed there deliberately, and somehow, before even unfolding it, I knew exactly who had written it. Sherlock Holmes had left me one final message. For several moments I simply stared at the folded paper lying in my hand. The roar of the Reichenbach Falls seemed distant now, drowned beneath the pounding of my own heart. The note had been left deliberately. Of that, there could be no doubt. The silver cigarette case had served as a marker, placed where it could catch the eye of anyone searching the scene. More specifically, anyone searching for Sherlock Holmes. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the pages. The handwriting was instantly recognizable, clear, precise, steady. There was no sign of haste, no indication of panic. The words appeared as carefully written as any note Holmes might have composed in the comfort of Baker Street. That realization alone filled me with sorrow. It suggested that when he wrote the message, he had already understood what was about to happen. The note began as a farewell. Holmes explained that Professor Moriarty was waiting nearby while he completed the letter. The 2 men had met at last, face to face, beyond the interference of police, courts, or witnesses. The final stage of their struggle had arrived. What struck me most was the absence of fear. Holmes did not write as a man facing disaster. Instead, he wrote as someone who had accepted the consequences of his choices. For years he had pursued Moriarty. For years he had sought to dismantle the vast criminal organization hidden beneath the surface of society. Now that mission was complete. The professor's empire had fallen. Its members were being arrested. Its secrets had been exposed. The danger it posed to countless innocent people had been ended. Holmes expressed satisfaction in that achievement. If a personal sacrifice was required to secure it, he seemed prepared to accept the cost. He also revealed something that surprised me deeply. The letter from Meiringen had not deceived him. He had suspected from the beginning that it was a trap, yet he had allowed me to leave anyway. Not because he wished to face Moriarty alone, but because he understood that the confrontation had become unavoidable. He preferred that I remain safely away from it. Near the end of the note, Holmes included several practical instructions concerning the evidence gathered against Moriarty's organization. Even in what appeared to be his final moments, his thoughts remained focused upon justice. Only then came his farewell, simple, dignified, unforgettable. As I lowered the pages, the mist drifted around me, and the waterfall thundered below. For the first time, the terrible truth became impossible to deny. Sherlock Holmes had known this moment was coming, and he had walked toward it willingly. For a long time I remained beside the falls, Holmes's letter still clutched in my hand. The spray drifted across the path. The endless roar of the water echoed from the cliffs. Everything around me felt unreal. Part of me wanted to reject what the evidence suggested. Part of me still hoped that some explanation remained undiscovered. Yet the facts before me were difficult to ignore. Years spent beside Sherlock Holmes had taught me that truth must be faced, however painful it may be. Slowly I forced myself to examine the scene once more. The footprints remained clearly visible in the damp earth. 2 men had walked toward the end of the path. Neither had returned. The marks of a struggle could be seen near the cliff edge. Broken branches hung over the abyss below. The disturbed soil showed signs of desperate movement. Every clue pointed toward the same conclusion, and yet I found myself searching for alternatives. Perhaps Holmes had escaped. Perhaps he had found some route unknown to me. Perhaps Moriarty alone had fallen. The human mind clings stubbornly to hope, especially when confronted with loss. I studied every detail with the care Holmes himself would have applied. Again and again my observations led me back to the same grim possibility. Confrontation had occurred exactly where the evidence suggested. The final contest between Holmes and Moriarty had taken place on that narrow strip of ground overlooking the falls. The note added further weight to the conclusion. Holmes had clearly expected the encounter. He had anticipated danger. He had written his farewell before the struggle began. Nothing about the letter suggested uncertainty. Instead, it carried the calm acceptance of a man who had already considered every outcome. As these thoughts settled upon me, a profound sadness took hold. For years, Holmes had stood at the center of my most extraordinary experiences. Together we had uncovered mysteries, pursued criminals, and traveled through dangers that would have seemed impossible to ordinary people. Now, standing alone beside the Reichenbach Falls, I was forced to confront a future without him. The realization felt almost unbearable, yet there was still one responsibility remaining. Holmes had entrusted me with the truth. The world would need to know what had happened. The achievements of his life deserved to be remembered. And as I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my coat, I understood that my role in the story was not yet finished. The task of telling Sherlock Holmes's final adventure had only just begun. The descent from the Reichenbach Falls was the hardest journey I have ever made. Only a few hours earlier, Holmes and I had climbed the same path together. We had admired the mountains, discussed our plans, and spoken of the future. Now I walked alone. The beauty of the Swiss landscape no longer held any meaning for me. The forests, streams, and distant peaks seemed little more than shadows surrounding my grief. Again and again, my thoughts returned to Holmes's final letter. I replayed every line in my memory. The calmness of his words troubled me more than anything else. There had been no panic, no bitterness, no self-pity, only the steady reasoning that had characterized him throughout his life. Even when facing what appeared to be his final moments, Holmes had remained exactly as he had always been, clear-minded, focused, unwavering. When I finally returned to Meiringen, the hotel proprietor immediately recognized that something terrible had occurred. The expression on my face must have revealed more than words ever could. I told him enough to explain the situation, though speaking the details aloud proved surprisingly difficult. The reality seemed to become more painful each time it was described. Local authorities were informed, and efforts were made to investigate the scene. Yet there was little they could do. The gorge below the falls was among the most dangerous places imaginable. The torrent crashed through deep chasms, hidden channels, making any recovery attempt nearly impossible. Experienced guides examined the evidence and reached the same conclusion that I had already reached myself. A struggle had taken place. Two men had gone over the edge. The falls had claimed them. That night, I slept very little. The sound of rushing water seemed to follow me even inside the hotel. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw Holmes standing beside the falls for the last time, arms folded, calm and thoughtful, watching the swirling mist rise from the abyss below. The image remained vivid and painfully clear. By morning, I knew there was only one course left open to me. I would return to England. There were people who deserved to know the truth, friends who would mourn him, authorities who would need the information contained in his final message. Most importantly, there was a story that had to be told. For if Sherlock Holmes was truly gone, the world deserved to remember not merely how his life ended, but how he had spent that life fighting against darkness wherever he found it. The journey back to England passed like a dream. Days seemed to blend together without meaning. Trains carried me across Europe, steamships crossed the Channel, and familiar landscapes slowly returned to view. Yet my thoughts remained fixed upon a narrow mountain path in Switzerland. Again and again I replayed the events leading to the tragedy, the warning from Moriarty, the attacks in London, the pursuit across Europe, the forged letter from Meiringen. Each step now appeared to have been moving toward the same inevitable conclusion. When I finally reached London, the city felt strangely different. The streets were as busy as ever. Carriages rattled along familiar roads. Crowds filled the pavements. Life continued exactly as it had before, and yet for me, something fundamental had changed. Every corner of the city carried memories of Holmes. A particular street might remind me of a case we had solved together. A passing cab might recall one of our hurried pursuits. Even the fog drifting along the Thames seemed connected to some forgotten adventure. It was impossible to escape those memories, nor did I truly wish to. News of the destruction of Moriarty's organization soon became public knowledge. The arrests had been remarkably successful. Criminals who had long operated beyond the reach of the law now faced trial. Hidden networks were exposed. Long unsolved crimes finally received explanations. The evidence Holmes had assembled proved devastating. Even in his absence, his work continued to achieve results. The newspapers devoted considerable attention to the affair. Yet few people understood the full story. Most knew only fragments. Most never realized how close society had come to remaining under the influence of Moriarty's criminal empire. Fewer still understood the sacrifice that had made its destruction possible. As the days passed, letters arrived from individuals whose lives had been touched by Holmes's work. Some expressed grief, others gratitude. Many simply refused to believe that such a man could truly be gone. I understood the feeling. At times I found it difficult to accept myself. Sherlock Holmes had always seemed larger than ordinary life, too intelligent, too resourceful, too extraordinary to vanish so completely, and yet the evidence remained undeniable. The Reichenbach Falls had claimed both Holmes and Moriarty. The great struggle was over. The criminal mastermind was dead, and so it seemed was the greatest detective the world had ever known. Or so I believed at the time, for there remained one final chapter to this story that I could not yet see, a chapter hidden beyond the veil of grief and loss, a chapter that the future would reveal. In the weeks that followed my return to London, I found myself struggling to adapt to ordinary life. My medical practice demanded attention, and patients continued to arrive each day with their illnesses and concerns. Outwardly, everything appeared normal. Yet beneath that routine lay a profound emptiness. For many years, Sherlock Holmes had been a constant presence in my life. His sudden absence left a void that could not easily be filled. Often while walking through London, I would find myself glancing toward Baker Street. Without thinking, the familiar habit remained long after its purpose had vanished. Then reality would return, and I would remember. The room stood silent. The violin was quiet. The great detective was gone. At least, that was what the world believed. Public interest in the Moriarty case remained intense. Newspaper articles continued to discuss the remarkable criminal organization that had operated beneath the surface of society for so long. Details emerged from court proceedings. Evidence collected by Holmes exposed crimes stretching back many years. One by one, members of Moriarty's network faced justice. The results were extraordinary. Fraud schemes collapsed. Criminal partnerships disintegrated. Hidden conspiracies came to light. Even in death, Holmes seemed to be completing investigations he had begun while alive. Many people praised the police for their success. Others spoke of Moriarty's downfall. But few understood who truly deserved the credit. Without Holmes, none of it would have happened. He had uncovered the web. He had followed the clues. He had devoted years of effort to revealing the truth. As I reflected upon these events, I became increasingly convinced that his achievements should not be forgotten. The public knew Sherlock Holmes as a detective. I knew him as something more. A man of immense discipline. A man willing to endure danger in pursuit of justice. A man whose extraordinary intellect had always been matched by an equally extraordinary sense of duty. That conviction eventually led me to make a decision. The true story deserved to be recorded, not the rumors, not the incomplete newspaper reports, not the distorted accounts offered by those who knew nothing of the facts, the truth. Only I possessed Holmes's final letter. Only I had witnessed the events leading to the tragedy. And so I resolved to write it all down, every detail, every clue, every step of the journey that had ended at the Reichenbach Falls. It was a painful task, but it was one I owed to my friend. For if Sherlock Holmes could no longer speak for himself, then I would ensure that his final adventure would never be forgotten. As I began the difficult task of recording Holmes's final adventure, I discovered that memories returned with remarkable clarity. Events I had not considered for years seemed to arise effortlessly from the past. I could hear his voice. I could picture the thoughtful expression that appeared whenever a difficult problem captured his attention. I could even imagine the familiar sound of his violin drifting through the rooms of Baker Street on a quiet evening. The more I reflected upon our years together, the more I realized how extraordinary they had been. At the time, many adventures had seemed merely exciting. Only later did I fully appreciate how unusual Holmes truly was. His powers of observation often appeared almost magical to those who encountered them for the first time. Yet I knew that there was no magic involved. Everything came from discipline, from patience, from countless hours spent training his mind to notice what others overlooked. People frequently admired Holmes for his intelligence. Few recognized the effort behind it. Even fewer understood the sacrifices it demanded. He devoted himself completely to his work. Comfort meant little to him. Fame interested him only when it served a purpose. Money mattered far less. And then the satisfaction of solving a problem, the pursuit of truth, remained his greatest reward. As I wrote about the final struggle with Moriarty, I found myself thinking not only about Holmes's abilities, but about his character. The world often viewed him as cold and detached. That judgment was unfair. True, he concealed his emotions better than most people, but beneath that reserved exterior lay deep loyalty and compassion. Again and again I had seen him risk his safety for strangers. Again and again he had placed justice above personal gain. His methods could be unusual. His manner could sometimes appear distant. Yet his actions revealed the truth. He cared deeply about the innocent people he protected. That was why he had pursued Moriarty so relentlessly, not for personal glory, not to prove his superiority, but because he understood the harm Moriarty's organization inflicted upon society. As these thoughts filled my mind, my grief became mixed with gratitude. I had not merely known a great detective. I had known a remarkable friend, and though the pain of his loss remained sharp, I felt privileged to have witnessed even a portion of his extraordinary life. For among all the men I have ever met, none possessed such wisdom, courage, and dedication. None left a greater mark upon the world. And none will ever be remembered by me with greater admiration than Sherlock Holmes. Although the world remembered Sherlock Holmes as the hero of the Reichenbach Falls, there was another figure whose presence lingered in my thoughts long after the tragedy, Professor James Moriarty. Even after his death, I found it difficult to fully comprehend the man. During our years of adventure, Holmes had faced countless criminals. Some were greedy, some were violent, others were driven by revenge or desperation. Moriarty was different. He stood apart from them all. What made him so dangerous was not cruelty alone. There have always been cruel men in the world. Nor was it merely intelligence. Many intelligent people have used their gifts for noble purposes. It was the combination of extraordinary intellect and complete moral corruption that made Moriarty unique. He possessed the mind of a scholar and the ambitions of a conqueror. While others committed crimes for immediate gain, Moriarty thought in terms of systems and networks. He organized wrongdoing on a scale rarely imagined by ordinary citizens. Entire groups of criminals operated beneath his direction without ever seeing the full design. His influence extended through London like invisible roots beneath the soil. Most people never knew he existed. That was his greatest achievement, and perhaps his greatest danger. Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder how long his empire might have survived had Holmes not discovered it. How many additional crimes would have been committed? How many lives would have been damaged? How many innocent people would have suffered? The answers can never be known. What is certain is that Holmes recognized the threat long before anyone else. While society remained unaware, he quietly devoted years of effort to exposing the hidden structure behind London's criminal world. It was a task that demanded extraordinary persistence. At times, Holmes himself admitted that Moriarty had pushed him harder than any opponent before or since. The contest between them was not simply a battle between detective and criminal. It was a struggle between two of the most remarkable minds of their generation. One sought order, the other thrived upon chaos. One used intellect to protect society, the other used it to exploit society, and in the end, their conflict carried them to the lonely heights of Switzerland. There, beside the roaring waters of the Reichenbach Falls, both men disappeared from the world. Yet while Moriarty left behind fear and destruction, Holmes left behind something far more enduring, a legacy of justice, and that perhaps was the final victory. As time passed, public interest in the Moriarty case gradually faded. New scandals replaced old ones. Fresh mysteries occupied newspaper headlines. The world continued forward, as it always does. Yet for me, certain questions remained unresolved. The evidence at the Reichenbach Falls had seemed overwhelming. The footprints, the signs of struggle, the broken vegetation near the edge. Holmes' farewell letter. Together they formed a convincing picture of what had occurred. And yet, there were moments when I found myself revisiting every detail, not because I doubted the evidence, but because Sherlock Holmes had taught me to question everything. Many times during our adventures, the obvious explanation had proven incorrect. Again and again, Holmes had revealed hidden possibilities where others saw only certainty. Those lessons were difficult to forget. On quiet evenings, I occasionally spread out my notes and reviewed the events once more. I retraced our journey across Europe. I studied Holmes's final letter. I recalled every conversation we had shared during those last days. The exercise never changed the conclusion. Still, I could not entirely silence a faint voice in the back of my mind. A voice asking whether every possibility had truly been explored. Perhaps grief was responsible. Perhaps friendship made acceptance difficult. Whatever the reason, I sometimes found myself remembering one particular detail. Holmes had known the letter from Meiringen was a trap. He had admitted as much in his farewell message. That meant he had expected Moriarty's arrival, expected danger, expected a confrontation. And yet, he had remained. The thought intrigued me. Holmes rarely entered any situation without preparing for multiple outcomes. Contingency plans were second nature to him. He habitually considered possibilities that escaped everyone else. Could even such a careful man have walked toward the falls without some strategy in mind? The question lingered. But it remained only a question. There was no evidence to support it, no facts, no proof, only speculation. Eventually I would set such thoughts aside and return to reality. The reality was simple. The world believed Sherlock Holmes was dead. The authorities believed it. The newspapers believed it, and I believed it as well. Yet somewhere deep within me, a small uncertainty refused to disappear completely, a final unanswered question hidden among all the answers, a faint shadow of doubt that would remain long after everyone else had accepted the story's ending. And though I did not know it then, that doubt would one day prove more important than I could possibly imagine. Months passed after the tragedy at the Reichenbach Falls. Then months became years. Life continued, as life always does. Patients filled my consulting room. Friends came and went. London remained busy and restless, forever changing, and yet somehow remaining the same. But there was one place I found difficult to visit, Baker Street. From time to time, my work brought me into that part of the city. Whenever it did, I would inevitably find my eyes drawn toward the familiar building where so many adventures had begun. The windows remained unchanged. The street remained unchanged. Only one thing was missing: Sherlock Holmes. The sight always stirred powerful memories. I would remember late-night discussions beside the fire, the sudden arrival of anxious clients, the excitement of the new mystery unfolding, the extraordinary moments when Holmes transformed a handful of insignificant clues into a complete and brilliant solution. Those rooms had once been alive with energy. Now they existed only in memory. Occasionally, I encountered people who spoke of Holmes. Some remembered his famous cases. Others recalled newspaper reports about the destruction of Moriarty's organization. Many treated him almost as a legendary figure, rather than a real man. I listened politely, rarely revealing how closely I had known him. No public account could fully capture the reality. The world admired Holmes for his remarkable intellect. I admired him for something deeper: his determination, his courage, his willingness to stand against dangers that others could scarcely comprehend. Those qualities were not as easily described in newspapers, yet they were the qualities I remembered most. One autumn evening, I found myself walking past Baker Street as dusk settled over London. The gas lamps had begun to glow softly in the gathering darkness. A thin mist drifted along the pavement. The scene reminded me so strongly of earlier years that I stopped for several moments and simply looked up at the familiar windows. An odd feeling came over me. Not sorrow, not exactly. Something closer to reflection. Holmes had once remarked that a person's life should be judged by what remains after they are gone. If that was true, then few men had lived more successfully. Even in absence, his influence endured. Criminals feared his reputation. Investigators studied his methods. Ordinary citizens benefited from the safer world he had helped create. As I resumed my walk through the fading evening light, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude. The loss remained painful, but so too did the privilege of having known him. And lo, Baker Street now stood silent. The memory of Sherlock Holmes continued to live far beyond its walls. As I completed the account of Holmes's final adventure, I found myself returning once more to the events that had begun on that April evening in my consulting room. At the time, I could not have imagined where that visit would lead. A tired and watchful Sherlock Holmes appeared at my door, carrying the weight of a secret war that had been raging beneath the surface of London. Within days, we had crossed England. Within weeks, we had crossed Europe. And at the end of that journey stood the Reichenbach Falls. Looking back, the chain of events seemed almost inevitable. Holmes had spent years pursuing Professor Moriarty. Moriarty had spent years avoiding capture. Eventually, their paths could only lead to a final confrontation. Neither man was willing to yield. Neither man could abandon the course he had chosen. The result was the tragedy that unfolded in Switzerland. Yet, as I reflected upon those events, I realized that focusing solely upon the ending would miss a larger truth. The value of Holmes's life did not depend upon how it ended. It depended upon how it was lived. Throughout his career, he had confronted dangers that others feared to face. He had challenged powerful criminals. He had protected strangers he had never met. He had devoted his extraordinary abilities to the service of justice. Again and again, he chose difficult paths when easier alternatives existed. That, more than any single case, defined his character. The destruction of Moriarty's organization stood as one of his greatest achievements. The criminal empire that had once stretched across London was gone. Its members had been exposed. Its influence had been broken. Countless future crimes had been prevented. Though few members of the public understood it, society owed great debt to Sherlock Holmes. As for me, I knew that no future companion would ever replace him. No friendship could duplicate one we had shared. Together we had experienced adventures that seemed impossible. Together we had witnessed both the best and worst aspects of human nature, and together we had traveled farther than either of us could have imagined on the day we first met. The years would continue. Life would move forward, but the memory of Sherlock Holmes would remain, not merely as a detective, not merely as a brilliant mind, but as a friend whose courage, intelligence, and dedication changed countless lives. And so, with gratitude as well as sorrow, I brought my account to its conclusion, or so I believe. For the world thought Sherlock Holmes' story had ended at the Reichenbach Falls. The world was mistaken. And so, dear listener, I come at last to the end of this remarkable story. The events of the Reichenbach Falls marked the conclusion of an era in my life. For years, Sherlock Holmes and I had walked the streets of London together. We had pursued murderers through fog-covered alleys, uncovered hidden conspiracies, and brought dangerous criminals before the law. Those adventures had become so familiar that I sometimes imagined they would continue forever. But nothing in this world continues forever, not even the greatest partnerships. When I stood beside the roaring waters of the Reichenbach and read Holmes's final letter, it seemed that a chapter had closed forever. The world's greatest detective had vanished. His greatest enemy had vanished with him, and the long struggle that had consumed both men had finally reached its end. Yet, as time passed, I came to understand something important. A life should not be measured solely by its final moments. It should be measured by its influence, by the good it leaves behind, by the people it touches. Judged by that standard, Sherlock Holmes achieved more than most men could hope to accomplish in several lifetimes. He gave comfort to the innocent. He brought fear to the guilty. He revealed truth where deception flourished, and he demonstrated what a disciplined mind could achieve when devoted to a worthy purpose. Many who knew his name admired his intelligence. I admired something else, his unwavering commitment to justice. Again and again, he chose difficult paths because they were the right ones. Again and again, he placed himself in danger to protect people he had never met. Those qualities mattered more than any clever deduction, more than any celebrated case, more than any newspaper headline. As I finish this account, I can still picture him as I saw him on that final morning in Switzerland, standing calmly beneath the towering mountains, watching the mist rise from the falls, unafraid, determined, ready to face whatever awaited him. The world would remember Sherlock Holmes as a detective. I remember him as a friend, a loyal companion, a brilliant mind, and above all, a man who never turned away from a challenge when duty called. If these pages preserve even a small part of that truth, then they have served their purpose. For though the voice of Sherlock Holmes may fall in silent, his legacy endures. And while future generations continue to tell his stories, the great detective of Baker Street will never truly be forgotten. This, then, is the story of the final problem. Or at least it appeared to be, for history has a curious habit of hiding its greatest surprises until the moment when they are least expected. And somewhere beyond this ending, another mystery was already waiting.